the variation that exists in people's behavior has always been known. But the question is, what's like the status of that variation? Like, what do we think about that? Like, do we think about that as like sort of the thing that we're really asking about? Or is that like, oh no, that's something we have to explain away and get rid of? And then what ends up happening is then you start homogenizing groups of people that are actually way more variable than we think, right? And so there's a lot more linguistic variation, even in places that are thought of as being really monolingual.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I'm your host, Talia Sherman. Happy summer. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode, at its core, is about ideologies. I'm joined by Savithry Namboodiripad to discuss everything from the idealizations of the native monolingual speaker in linguistics to ideologies of purity in everything from genetics to language to science. There's so much frustration throughout this episode about eugenics, about misogyny, and academic frameworks that essentialize and naturalize language's relationship to constructed variables. But what I find remarkable is not the frustration, but the fact that Savi is a linguist, frustrated with linguistics, who continues to improve upon her experimental design, pedagogical practices, and theoretical framings by incorporating critiques of the field into her work. But it's important to remember, linguistics is not alone in its failure. Science needs variables, and society provides them. Frameworks make things make sense, so they stay. The question for me right now is, what, if anything, makes language unique? What, if anything, makes language immune to certain critiques or particularly susceptible to others? This episode was a lot of fun to record and produce. I hope it brings some laughter, some critical thought, and some reflection into your summer. So please welcome back into your ears, Savi. Savi, welcome to Tomato Tomato. Could you please introduce yourself so that I don't butcher your name?
Yeah, my name is Savithry Namboodiripad, or that's how I say it in English, but I say it in different ways when I'm speaking the language I grew up speaking, which is Malayalam. But I usually go by Savi. So I'm just, I guess, recently an associate professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in linguistics.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. And can you say a little bit more about like what you research, who you are, what you're interested in right now in linguistics? I know that you have a lot of experience in syntax.
Yes, yeah. So I've sort of shifted how I identify across the different stages of my career. But I usually describe myself as I study language contact and syntactic typology, and then also the field of linguistics. So I'm interested in methods and ways of knowing and sort of how we know things and what are the types of evidence that we use. What does that evidence tell us? How do those types of evidence, like when they get contextualized in different theoretical frames or different ways of knowing, like how does that affect what we think about how language works? So it's like I'm interested in language contact and what happens when people are in multilingual contexts and how language changes or doesn't in those contexts. I study word order. That's what my dissertation was about, and I'm interested in that. But then the way I kind of talk about it is I kept getting stuck in like, well, how do we know about these things? Or, oh, wait, I need to do this experiment in this new context. Oh, wait, I have to go back to some first principles about like what we're actually doing here when we're measuring things or asking certain types of questions.
For sure. So already like so much I feel like is fascinating there because yeah, like you have all this experience with syntax and word order. And then, I'm looking at your like resume and everything like that. And you've taught everything from experimental typology to language and discrimination and things that are cross-listed in anthropology. And then you're involved in all these efforts to kind of investigate the field of linguistics as kind of like what happens interpersonally within linguists, but then also theoretical frameworks that we receive and inherit that we kind of take for granted as we go along our like research and teaching journeys. And this is important to me because kind of like being a sociolinguist or having done work there and then like interviewing so many anthropologists and people that are very critical of the field, I've gotten very worried about like what is happening. It's like I interviewed Jonathan Rosa, who I know you have read his work and cite it a lot. And like, after interviewing him, he's amazing. But like I went through this whole period of kind of like revelation. I was like, everything's failing. Like we failed. Like this is I was like so concerned, right? I see your face. You're like, is that right? Right. So I think like, how do you feel about linguistics right now? There's a lot that we've received that's problematic and there's a lot of work that we need to do, but you're also not an anthropologist. You're not in an education department. You are a linguist. So how do you feel about linguistics, the field right now?
Oh, there's so many layers to also what you said, but also what I think about this. Um, I guess there's one short, really short answer, which is hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because we have to be. And I think it's just not just about linguistics or just about academia, but about our world. Like cannot we need to critique, we need to identify things that are not working or things that we're carrying that we can let go. We need to, we need to do those things, but we also have to give people models and methods and ways forward out of those ways that people have been stuck, right? So I think that I have to be, and I am hopeful sort of as a choice on purpose, because that's the way that we make changes, like in the world, right? And also in the different spaces where we have spheres of influence. So this is a way of thinking. One of my collaborators, Karine Aquino, when I was working on this survey about harassment and bias in linguistics with her and Lena Ho and a bunch of amazing students at the University of Michigan, she brought in this idea of like spheres of influence to me. Like that's not like a new thing, but she's the one that like introduced it to me. And what she always thinks about is like, all right, where do we have these spheres of influence? And how can we find the power that we have in those spaces, use like the resources and the knowledge that we have to move things forward? How can we give other people, and I think about it as like, how can we give people the sort of tools like, hey, okay, you don't want to use that term anymore, or like, oh, this feels icky to you. Here's an alternative, right? That's one way of thinking about it. I think that it's not wrong to be like, we should burn everything down. Like, I don't think that that's incorrect as like a way of thinking about it. I think it's just like everybody has a role to play in the revolution. And so we can all think about like, what are our pieces of that and what are their sort of like skills and ways that we can motivate the people around us and ourselves to trying to push things forward. So yes, I guess like, so going back to how you were thinking about this idea of like success and failure, I think that's, the decolonial theorists that I've worked with and read and engaged with, that has been a really helpful way for me to think about it, which is that the colonial project is a process, right? And it can succeed and it fail, and it's always succeeding and it's always failing. And so we need to think about also all of these other things that we're trying to do as process. And how can we let these oppressive things that are happening fail? And how can we help those fail? And how can we help liberatory practices succeed? Yeah. So, I mean, the answer was not that I gave you was not really about like what is going on in linguistics, because I think it's much more than that. And I think actually one of the things I think about with linguistics is like, well, yes, I do. I am in a linguistics department. I'm interested and engaged in the questions that people who identify as linguists ask, but those disciplinary boundaries are socially constructed, right? And so we can think much bigger than that. And I think that people who are doing the most exciting work are thinking much bigger than that. Yeah.
Totally. Okay, so like so much there, right? This is not just a problem with linguistics. I think that that's something important for linguists to think about, especially when they're going through periods of self-criticism and reconciliation of like, whoa, what? Hang on, this isn't just us. There are all the other sciences also have work to do to interrogate what really is their natural object and is there a natural object and blah, blah, blah. But thinking about this idea of success and failure, it's like, I think that I have been struggling with the idea that we have so many inherited problematic ideologies, and you've done a lot to interrogate those ideologies. But even just like in my own tiny little subfield, I worry about the ideologies for sure. I worry about the ideologies that you worry about nativeness and about essentialism and the way we do that. But then I also worry that like sociolinguistics just perpetuates the biases and the categories that it kind of wants to interrogate. If you turn race into a variable, how do you deconstruct it? I think that's a legitimate question. And when you do studies that you've done on a word order and on syntax, it's like, well, whoever said that was even that's a received notion too. So there's a lot to interrogate before you can even ask your research question, which I think stalls the research project process sometimes. So let's talk about let's name the ideologies we're talking about. So first off, essentialism. You have done a lot of work about essentialism in linguistics, and then also the native speaker, this idea that there is ever a native speaker. Because the reality is that so much of linguistics research for a long time was just like monolingual white English speakers, and we figured out, quote unquote, what language is. But that's not the majority of people in this world, right? Like the majority of people in this world are not monolingual white English speakers. Multilingualism is much more common in other countries besides the US. And of course, it's a problem that we have so much monolingualism here. You disagree? Please. So like, what are the ideologies that we're talking about? What's going on with your critiques of the native speaker? How do we reject that in linguistics? How do we bring things that are unmarked into markedness? Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was sort of like, like thinking, like, I guess doing like a thinky head shake when you were talking about the idea of like monolingualism in the US, because one project I'm working on that's, so close to, I just have to finish writing it up with one of my collaborators, Loretta Chang, is actually asking that question, like sort of, thinking about what is the prevalence of monolingualism in the US? Like, how do we define that, right? And other people have done this. So, and this is, other people have critiqued these things. And this is kind of, one of the things that's really helpful and helpful for me as a linguist, knowing that other people have the same problems, right? Is that other people have given us critiques and ways of thinking about these things, and then we can like read them and use that in our context, right? So like we're thinking about race as a variable. Like there are lots of scholars who have studied racialization, racecraft, like all of these different things, race as a process, and we have theoretical frames that we can think about how to apply those things in the context that we're working in, right? And sociolinguists have done that very successfully. People who identify as sociolinguists have done that, in some ways too, right? So there are these frames that we can look to. And so that is one thing, right? It's like that we asked people who are, primary English speakers on this Prolific, which is like a experiment recruitment platform. And that's how we, recruit online participants to do like acceptability judgment tasks, which is like the sort of experimental syntactician's bread and butter. So it's like, all right, you listen to a sentence if it's me, or you read a sentence and you rate how good that sentence sounds, and we find all this information about that, and it's correlated with all these different things. And yes, there's a lot of assumptions in there that we have to state very clearly about what we're actually measuring when we're doing that, but it's a very classic method. So these are the people that, like, if I were, and I'm going to write about, this syntactic construction in English, this is the pool of people, right? But if you just ask those people in a more open-ended way, in a way that's sociolinguistically informed or informed by variation, like assuming variation, informed by language contact theories, hey, here's how we think about how people use language. And that could include named languages or not named languages. Turns out people are way more multilingual than we think, even this population that's constructed as being homogenized. And so that's like one piece that, I think has been really helpful for me to think about too, is it's not just, we have these inherited assumptions like, that native speakers are a thing that, even though we know, like, and everybody has known from the very beginning who have used these terms that like we're thinking about this as like an idealization as opposed to like something that's like, that there'll be like things that are like, extraneous factors that will make that person behave less native. Like people have the variation that exists in people's behavior has always been known. But the question is, what's like the status of that variation? Like, what do we think about that? Like, do we think about that as like sort of the thing that we're really asking about? Or is that like, oh no, that's something we have to explain away and get rid of? And then what ends up happening is then you start homogenizing groups of people that are actually way more variable than we think, right? And so there's a lot more linguistic variation, even in places that are thought of as being really monolingual than we think about. And so that's also been really, that just way of thinking has been really helpful and exciting for me, because I think a lot of times when I talk to folks like, oh yeah, I'm working in language contact, I'm interested in word order in these like, places where there's like, these different languages that are really relevant. People are like, oh, that sounds so complicated. Like, it's like, no, actually, everything is more complicated than we think. Like, it's just we're sort of ignoring some of the complication and thinking that we're explaining certain things when we're not, right? So that's sort of one way of thinking about this idea of marking the unmarked. I guess going back to that part of your question is that the process of unmarking things, which is also, that includes, I mean, people who study racialization and talk about this with the idea of whiteness, like, and how like markedness relates to whiteness. Things like how, sort of socially powerful groups and modes and ways of thinking become unmarked. And that's part of this whole thing that we're trying to reject and problematize. But when we just start becoming a lot more accurate about what we're actually measuring and interested in, and asking the same questions of everybody, like, so the questions that asking people that are thought to be monolingual English speakers, the questions that I would ask people who grew up in Kerala speaking Malayalam and English and having to learn all these things, then you start finding that, oh, there's a lot of variation everywhere. And there's a lot of similarity in how that variation looks. And there's also difference, but it's not like random. It's not just messy. It's sort of explained by factors that we think matter. But also now we're becoming a lot more accurate in how we sort of understand and compare people's language use and what they know and how they use it and all of these different things. So yeah, I think it's about like figuring out what are we actually interested in, which is why then we have to think about theory and like causal factors and like what is the mechanism, like what is the thing that we think is going on. And once we start becoming a lot more specific, then we end up having to ask those more complicated questions of people that are thought to of being like very simple and we know everything about them. And actually then American English becomes more complicated than we think, right? Than even exactly, like variation of sociolinguists think, and they know that it's very complicated.
Right, but sometimes it's very easy to say, I'm going to just look at like white girls in this particular middle school, and then I'm going to like find no variation. I'll be able to figure out exactly what their particular variation looks like, and then I can say they're using these particular phonetic variables to get across this social ideology or like this particular way that they want to do identity, but it's like, well, there's probably variation in there, and then like who's to say, right? Like who's to say? Language is not always above our threshold of metalinguistic awareness. It's like
right. It's like, what do we think? I mean, even one thing so I work on this with this group called the Role Collective that my collaborator Ethan Kotlu and I started, and then it's like a lot of folks internationally and a lot of people who are doing work in that do like think about assessments, right? So we can critique, and we should critique all we want, but we also have to think about, well, what tools are we giving people that need to like write a test or evaluate, and we can also critique those structures that require us to do those things. And that is also something that people are doing. And I think that is also useful. At the same time, like, I think this idea of just stopping and not doing anything until we have it all figured out is not how like anything works. So we have to think about like, all right, maybe we can do both, right? It's a sort of yes and like way of thinking about it. And so I have the collaborators who, are thinking really carefully about like, okay, well, how do we ask about variation and variance without establishing baselines? And it turns out you can, like, you really can do it. It just is a different way of inquiry, but like it still can get at the things that you care about. It just requires you to be actually way more specific about what you think matters when it comes to a particular behavior or set of knowledges or practices. You just have to be a little bit more specific.
Totally. And ROLE stands for Reframing Our Language Experience.
Yes.
And that's a really cool initiative that you started. So totally. I would love to talk about sort of how your research goes in here, because you're right. Like, we can't just stop and then figure everything out. Like, we have to keep going. And there's a lot of good that research can do. So, you were trained in this, like, quote unquote, theoretical linguistics background. And I'm really curious to ask you about that, because I know that you've expressed some sort of dissatisfaction in the way that we think that linguists or that language could ever really be just theoretical. But you have a lot of experience and training in that background. But then, you bring in perspectives from psycholinguistics and historical linguistics and sociolinguistics and language acquisition and like language policy when you're doing your paper. So you have a couple great papers. One's called Why We Need a Gradient Approach to Word Order, in which you push back against the idea that word order, it's like a set of option, like discrete options, but rather that we need some kind of gradient approach. So English's word order, for example, is SVO, right? Subject, verb, object. A great way that this has been illustrated by, have you heard of Catherine McKinnon? And she talks about sort of like gendered language and misogynist language, and she's a law professor. And she says, yeah, English SVO, man fucks woman. Yeah. Yeah, but that's the word order. But, sort of other word orders, subject, object, verb. But you're pushing back against the idea that these are discrete options and that we can have a gradient approach to word order. And then you also have a paper called Towards a Decolonial Syntax, Research, Teaching, and Publishing. And you talk about various pedagogical interventions and ways that we can reframe syntax as like both a political instruction, but like a political framework and a form that maybe is helpful sometimes, but maybe isn't helpful other times. And I think throughout all this, I see you pushing against the idea that, or like the assumption that language can ever really be reduced to a theory or a model, right? Because that's a lot of times the process. Like when I've taken syntax classes, I've taken semantics classes, and you're given models. And you have to fit whatever your sentence is onto this model. So like set theory and semantics and lambda abstraction and all these things, and you have to fit it around a model. And there's all different kinds of cases in syntax. And so it can get very theoretical. And sometimes as a student, I feel like I'm like, where did language go, right? Like, what do you mean the assignment on G? Like, I don't get it. So yeah, talk about how your research sort of fits in. But then you're bringing in perspectives from so many other subfields. So it's not just syntax. It's not just theoretical linguistics.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess one thing that I think is relevant is, so I love theory, but like theory, there's like different ways of thinking about theory. Also, there's lots of different theoretical approaches to syntax, right? So that's the other thing that like, there's other approaches to syntax that do bring in a little bit more of like, that are more multidimensional than like, and less abstractive, I guess.
Yeah. I don't mean to say that you're just
no. That's not what that's not what I meant
Okay.
to say, but I'm saying like, that's what's kind of, I think, interesting is like, yeah, I'm training in different theoretical approaches to syntax, which like that helped me understand a little bit more also like what is helpful for me and like the things that I think I'm actually studying, right? So and we know that, something like word order is not just about word order. You have to understand prosody and semantics and pragmatics, and you have to understand so many different things. That's true for any single thing that you're studying, right? These like sort of levels of linguistic analysis that the traditional ways, or like at least hegemonic in the United States ways of teaching about linguistics, and the way that we like split up these different levels of analysis, let's say. We know that that's not really how, when people use language and understand language, both sort of from a psycholinguistic perspective, but also from like social perspective, from their own subjectivities, like those separations that's not really how it works, right? And especially relevant if you're interested in like learning or change, because a lot of times it's the way that changes happen are because of there was like, something in the like pragmatics that then influences order, right? And so how we even make these distinctions between these subfields is, I think, something that a lot of people have problematized within the field of linguistics, right? Yes. So that's like also sort of, that's been helpful for, so I guess the reason, going back to like how I started thinking about things in this way, that's like, there's so many different disciplines, that's because I, did get training in areas of linguistics and types of approaches like usage-based approaches and constructional approaches that really bring in and don't assume these strict boundaries between these levels of linguistic analysis. So that helped me, first of all, describe the things that I was seeing in the languages and language that I was looking at. Like it helped me with the analyses I wanted to do, and it more matched what I felt like was going on, my own subjective experiences. But also it helped me think a little bit more about things like, what am I interested in? Like if I'm interested in what happens in a multilingual context, when people have different orders available to them, like why would that matter for how language changes, right? And then you have to understand how acquisition works, but also how people are categorizing the linguistic stimulus that they're getting and how that affects processing and production and all of these different things. And then it turns out that, oh, like some of these, what do we mean when we say case? Like we can formalize that and make sort of a formal model. We can also think about, oh, people seem to like care about, subjecthood. What is that? Okay, it's actually not just one thing. It's actually many things. Ooh, like is this really about a subjecthood or is it about like animacy? Interesting. Like, right? And so we can even bring back the language users' subjectivities into these different formal models and think about, well, okay, what's going on like in the person's experience of using the language? What are the things that are relevant from the context of the language user as the sentences are unfolding in time or as they're perceiving it, as they're producing it? And like, maybe that is relevant. Maybe it's not in a particular case, right? And so that's another, that's something that has been interesting and helpful for me to think about. So one is having these different trainings like has been helpful. And then also like, ooh, like what do I care about? Like it turns out it's not a bunch of things, like it's other things, right? And that's like also helpful too. Like, like I care about happens sort of, in these multilingual contexts, how people are using things, how they're acquiring them, how it's changing over their lifespan. All right, then those are the types of questions that I want to ask about. Yeah.
So I guess, let me rephrase that. So it's not that you're saying I want to have a gradient approach to word order or a decolonial syntax because theoretical linguistics was wrong or like inherently problematic. It's more like I just want to recenter the speaker's experience and our autonomy over language, maybe. Are you just sort of readjusting the focus onto the speaker rather than like the formal model? But you're not like trashing the formal model, I guess, maybe?
I mean, I don't think there's empirical support for some, depending on what formal model we're talking about, but I will say like, so that's sort of one piece because there's lots of formalizations of that make different assumptions about how language learning works and like acquisition over the lifespan. So that's, I guess, one piece. Yeah, I think that I don't think it's helpful to like uniformly trash, even though it's fun. Um, but I do try to think about like, all right, when people are working an approach that makes a lot of different assumptions than me, like giving somebody the benefit of the doubt about that, right? And this is like, not about like someone who's being a racist. Like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something where it's like we're all trying to be humans, like that are giving everyone the full humanity, and we have different ideas about how language works, and we're like formalizing things differently or we're operationalizing things differently. What I want to understand, I think what helps me become a better scholar and the people around me be better scholars is like, all right, what are you trying to do? What am I trying to do? What's different about that and why? And we might not end up agreeing because we're making fundamentally different assumptions about how the world works or about how learning works or something. But once we sort of break it down that way, then like it's just helpful because I don't want to just ignore research that other people are doing. Be like, it might be helpful for me, right? Like, and I've gotten a lot of like, and also like, let's say you're working on a language like Malayalam. Maybe the other people publishing in that discipline are using a different theoretical approach than you. So you can't just be like, nope, I don't know about that because I don't agree with like what their like basic theoretical assumptions are. Then it behooves me to like read and understand that and engage with it in the ways that it's relevant to be engaged with. And I don't want to be like, I figured it out, right? I think that's also just like, that's kind of like the beautiful thing about all of what we're doing as academics is like, this is part of like, we can't just stop and figure out all of our theoretical assumptions and then not do any research or like, and before moving forward is that we're going to be wrong sometimes. But if we're wrong because we're ignoring people, or if we're wrong because we're stuck in our silos, or if we're wrong because we're not reading carefully and across topics, then that is a different thing than being wrong because we need to do more work or something, right? Or because we're a part of a broader process. And so I don't want to be wrong because I was ignoring certain people, or I don't want to be wrong because I was too stuck in my own way of thinking about the world.
Yeah. Can I ask about like this kind of persistent idea in linguistics about like purity of the field. Like we have to find pure language. We have to distill. Let's put gesture aside. Let's put eye movement aside. Like let's put pragmatics even sometimes aside, and let's get to pure language, right? Or even like this is just like sad. I don't really understand why this is still a thing, but like there are so many places where sociolinguists are still not considered linguists, or they just like aren't there because the linguistics department has not felt the need to have them there. And this is a problem that's going to take a while to be fixed because, you know, even at a place like where I am at Brown, like there are sociolinguists now here, even though there haven't been in the past, but like the more senior linguists and the more theoretical ones never took a sociolinguistics course in their entire lives. So like, for example, I quoted like something from William Labov in a paper like a semester or two ago, and I was told like, what is this? And I was like, ain't no cat can't get in no coop. That's like a fundamental, very famous William Labov line. Like, what? You know, it's just like, if you're not exposed to the stuff that you don't know. But I was just kind of shocked. I was like, how is it that like there's so many people that are now at the like senior position in the field that just have never been exposed to this? But I think it's all about this ideology of like purity of language and purity of science, and we need to like distill the natural. So, in a talk that you gave once, you talked about how like someone said the language comes from like mother's milk or like breast milk. There's some ideology about like that's like super misogynist. Maybe you can explain that. I was like I was like, wait, what? Like we trace this back to like your mother? Like that's crazy. So how do you approach that? Like what's going on there with purity?
Oh my God. Okay, yes. I mean, I obviously could give a talk about that because I did, but I will say a little. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I was like writing all of that stuff while I was breastfeeding. And so like the first round of that paper was like breastfeeding my first kid. And then the second round we're like doing revisions. It was my second kid. And I was like, this is too ooky. Okay. And this is also why like we need to read beyond. I mean, I don't know. Again, like reading sort of widely helps us understand where these ideologies come from. And,
Right.
you know, this is amazing work done by scholars like, so Stephanie Hackert has written a book about native speaker and standard language ideology in the US. And then there's also work like Mother Tongues and Nations. There's work on like nationalism, European nationalism, and where this idea, like nativeness idea got so.
Well, even now with like the modern nation state, the whole idea is like purity and linguistic boundaries, and we need to have, and then that's how you get to like linguicide coinciding with ethnocide, blah blah. But like, you know, for real, like this is a thing. Like like even in America, you come to America, you learn English, right? Like
Yes, yes. I mean, these ideologies are really, and it's also helpful to see like, okay, right, like how people across contexts and times think about the relationship between language and identity, and in an essentialist way or not sometimes, right? Or like what is like, you know, yeah, it's not, we haven't always, and we don't all have these same ideologies about what it means to be a native speaker of a language, or what nativeness is and where it comes from and what are the conditions that are required for that. And those ideas are really tied up in, yeah, lots of different things. So I guess like to go back to your like, so if we want to talk about this idea of like the motherhood thing, right? So at least the story that we tell, this is the partial story. Okay, the story that we tell in this article about it is like it goes back to Dante. And so he like, and that was like one of the first like things I read like freshman year of college in a linguistics class was, you know, Dante talking about, you know, advocating for Italian, right, as opposed to Latin. Okay, so advocating for the vernacular. And the way that he defined these, you know, like I guess I'll say languages, but the way that he defined these modes of using language were like, oh, one is the language learned at the nurse's breast versus the other is the one that's taught in school. Okay. And so that is sort of this division. But actually, if you go back even further, there's this idea of breast milk as like a transmission, like metaphor. So it goes like back to like sort of liturgy, right? And at this time, if we're thinking about Europe, like different parts of this part of Europe anyway, and how like scholarship and, you know, sort of religious contexts were very intertwined, right? So these are sort of like liturgy and like, yeah, these are not like sort of separated ideas. So people talked a lot about how like, you know, so the Virgin Mary, like breastfeeding Jesus. This is like a big, like the lactating Mary is like a very like important image. And so there's all these like different interesting like images, and like there's like a saint that got like sainted with like, anyway, there's a lot of interesting images with that. And the idea there was that Mary transmitted like humanity to Jesus through her breast milk. And so that's how he got this like other human, more human, like the human qualities. Okay. And I'm speaking as this as an outsider. I am not Christian, I'm speaking as an outsider, non-expert. But the idea there was like, all right, there's this idea of transmission of culture and also then language through breast milk. Okay.
Right.
And so Dante, like when we're going like the Dante time, right? Like, so the way that like he was like who he was talking to was like, first of all, like is a certain class of people that have like wet nurses, right? So it's not like he's not talking about like a mom actually passing down language to a baby. It's like literally the idea of like a wet nurse, like nursing. So it's not like a biological inheritance in that way. It's like materially like through like milk. Okay. So then so that idea like sort of persists. And then we sort, then if we're thinking about like how this sort of genetic essentialism thing comes in, then we get into, eugenics and, like anyway, we have Galton, we have all these eugenicists, we have folks and the colonial project, racialization, hierarchies, right? So all these folks and this is when we think about the beginnings of linguistics and anthropology and all these disciplines, they were really clearly in service of both empire, in this right Western frame was empire, and also like missionary, like, so it was also conversion, right? So these are really like, this is where like the money is coming from, this is where the training is coming from, this idea is coming from. So that's also why we have to like understand those concepts before we think about, well, where do these ideas come from, right? It isn't that those contexts are really important. So what were people trying to do and understand? So their taxonomy and so typology, which is the field that I work in, that like the idea of creating types of languages is connected to creating types of people. And people were doing that. Of course, right when this is happening, right, there's also people like arguing with each other, like, no, that's not how it works, right? So there was always pushback, right? And that's also another thing that I think is important, like when we think about rejecting these inherited frames, like we can also think about that as learning from and uplifting people who have been arguing against us this whole time. That includes folks that were in like writing scholarship and in these privileged positions, but also the people who knew from the very start who were being studied and were like, fuck you, like, don't, that's not how my language works. And you are just trying to convert me. So I'm going to, give you like, I'm not going to speak to you in the way that I would, or whatever. Right. So people like, I think giving everybody agency as much as possible is important in this situation, including like the ideas that are so problematic that we're always pushed back against. But of course it's expeditious for folks that are trying to extract resources and create power imbalances, and it's expeditious for that to be the hegemonic narrative. Right. But we know that there's always counter narratives. Yeah. So it's you can't talk about the history of these different things without talking about this is like the intellectual ecology and when this is happening, right? And then if we're thinking about nations, there's a lot of people have written about, sort of one nation, one language, and these ideas that really got taken up. This is something that like I find, it's sort of important in the history of linguistics, but it's also like relevant to my own personal like background, because there's this idea of like, oh yeah, the Indo-Aryan languages or Indo-European, right? And so people were like obsessed with Sanskrit and all of these things. And I come from a family background where like my family is caste privileged. Like we're Brahmins. Like my grandpa, like, recited the Vedas or whatever, and like grew up learning Sanskrit and was like a priest and stuff. And so there's a lot of like oppression in the history of my family, but also like these are the people that the Nazis were literally valorizing, like, like Aryans, right? And so it's important to push back against that also, this idea of this like pure, like Vedic Sanskrit that was like handed down generations is like very fetishized and was very fetishized by people who are interested in racial hierarchies, sort of in the 1800s and to this day, right? There's actually a lady who was, God, I really went down a rabbit hole when I was looking up some stuff about this like a while ago. I was writing about, nation statehood and eugenics and linguistics and essentialism and racial essentialism, all these things. And then I came across this Nazi who changed her name to Savithry, my name.
Wow.
And she like went down to India to like just to be like an envoy for Nazis in India.
Wow.
And I was like, so this is personal for me because it's something that we need to push against. And also it's pernicious because it feels really intuitive to people like, oh yeah, like different people look different, so they must be different in this sort of essential way. And it's just not how any of this works. It's not how genetics works, it's not how biology works, it's not how society works. It's just not how any of this works. It's false.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of the challenges with how people think about, for example, incorrectly think about how language learning works is also based on this, right? This idea that like, oh, we have this critical period. Wait, is it 1? Is it 5? Is it 18 now? Like, people keep moving it around. Like,
right.
Okay. But a lot of those ideas are based on these very essentialist ideas of how language works and also false ideas about how learning works and false ideas about how brain development and biology work too. And so you just, we need to move on.
Thank you. No, I think what I would say just to like tie that is like you're pointing to the fact that essentialism and racism and racialized ideology and all these things, it's all connected, right? These ideologies about purity in the field and purity of language and like if language is mathematical and positivist, then that's more pure than if language is messy and like a site of discrimination, whatever. Okay. But then also that the solution and the refute of those ideas, they're also complicated and multifaceted and interconnected. And you're getting things wrong about acquisition, but also about neurobiology, but also about social norms and like the milieu in which someone is raised. Right. Like this is all connected. So it takes a real multifaceted approach to kind of combat these different things. And one of the ways in which you do that really well is by talking about pedagogy. This is something that you like think about clearly a lot. And so first off, it's cool to see that you see teaching as kind of an extension of where your research is, because that's not everyone thinks that way. So I appreciate that. But then also you have this great line in your paper on decolonial syntax about kind of like pushing against prescriptivism. And I don't know, but maybe you're alluding to the idea that maybe linguistics isn't always as descriptive as it wants to be. I know that other people often say that. They say like, you're saying this is all descriptive and maybe this is prescriptive. But you say, quote, rather than providing diagnostic of what to do or what steps to follow, a prescriptive trap that could end up as a tick box exercise, we have presented a series of provocations designed to aid reflection and action. So like there's a lot in there, but one that like description is going to be a process, like, and getting something better is going to be a process, and anything prescriptive is going to be this tick box, like you need to do this, you shouldn't do that, right? But then you also, I just kind of want to ask about pedagogy in general and like the way that you were using teaching to like do all the things that you want to do. Because yes, in your papers, you're like bringing in all these different perspectives and saying like, this is the way forward, but then also like giving talks about the ways to incorporate racial and linguistic justice and linguistic diversity into the classroom, into your syllabi. So like, what's going on there? You developed a new acronym. Like we have the WEIRD acronym, but you also developed the acronym of WISPY, right? So WEIRD, we have like Western educated, industrialist, rich, democratic. And then you developed WISPY, which is written, institutionally supported, standardized, and prestigious, quote unquote, languages. You're building new frameworks, new ideas. Like what's going on there?
So I will say, yeah, one way to answer it is we don't do any of it alone. So I'll give the quote that you said about the tick box exercise. I gotta credit Hannah Gibson, my several time collaborator, and but this comes out of conversations that she and many of us have had, which is and also again, engaging with decolonial scholars and other scholars who really push social justice theory and practice forward, which is, it's not just, oh, I did these 5 things and now I'm set. That's like not what it is, right? That's like, going back to what you said about like, or what we're talking about with like, this is a process. It succeeds and it fails. Like, and it's not just, it's hopeless and we move on necessarily. I mean, we can think about, again, that's something where I'm like, if someone thinks that, good on them. Like, because I would never presume to be like, no, you can't think that way. But I think that it's sort of a yes and again of like, well, that doesn't mean, I think we say this in our decolonial syntax chapter where we're like, well, some people have said, and actually a lot of linguistic anthropologists have said, like, well, we're not interested in studying the sort of structure of language at this point. We're interested in studying these like ideologies more, right? So the focus of inquiry like shifted because like, like if a lot of this is ideology, or if ideology is so central, which I also do believe that it is, then like where the ideologies come from becomes the object of study, right? And so what we say in that chapter is like, that doesn't mean that we should all like give up and then become linguistic anthropologists. Like, I don't think that that's true. I think that we can think about how those like theoretical assumptions can help us understand stuff. And folks like, oh my God, there's so many scholars who do that, right? That who center language ideologies. Anyway.
But that's harder because the senior people in the department are going to be like, well, that's not really language and blah, blah, blah. Like there's so much pushback that you get from doing those things. It's really hard. Yeah.
Right. Then it becomes like, all right, well, then how do we change norms? Well, we're linguists. We know like that change comes from above and below. Right. Hey,
or the waves,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also, we know that it comes from individual decisions, like a million tiny individual decisions, but also policy. And it takes all of that and shifting norms and how, like you said, how people are educated, right? Like what are the required courses? I was never required to take a sociolinguistics course in grad school. And
really? Like,
no, I don't think there even was.
Oh, well, you went to San Diego for grad school.
Yeah, I went to UCC.
I was thinking Chicago because Chicago must have had sociolinguists when you were there.
I did my master's there. And so there was like an intro sequence. I mean, now it's different. They hired people since I left. But when I was there, no, never took a I've never taken a sociolinguistics class. There was like an intro course, there was 1 quarter, so it's like 10 weeks. And it was like historical ling, socioling, and ling anth, maybe. It was like all 3, like a survey. And the professor was Michael Silverstein, and he read his papers, and I learned a ton. Like I did not understand it at the time, but it really helped me later. But it was that's what all it was. That was just a little intro-y, 2 week. We read LeBeau, we read this, and then we moved on. So yeah, no, that like engaging with that theory, right? There's so much theory in sociolinguistics and different types. That was not something that was part of my curriculum. So I had to really seek that out when I realized that it was really important to what I was studying. Yeah. So I think that it's, again, going back to the sort of very first thing we talked about, like these are structural issues, right? And so, and we know, like we can learn from sociologists and public policy, other people, like they study how do we change structures? And we also can learn from our own, like how do we change conventions? How do language conventions change, right? These are similar processes. And so it requires, all of that to push against it. Because like you're saying, if, and people have told me that oh, you're in the linguistics department. And which is funny because like my dissertation on word order, like what could be more, whatever, but it has come up many times in my career already of not doing something that's disciplinarily legible necessarily. Mm-hmm. And when I'm mentoring my students, I talk about that a lot because there's really, on one hand, we really do need to read widely and learn across, these sort of disciplinary, like things that are not within the disciplinary bounds, right? Things that are not within our curricular or syllabi. But on the other hand, depending on the type of job we want or what we want to do, and also to be like effective communicators, we need to understand the context and the experience of the people that we're talking to, right? Which is why, like I've sort of described some of my work as like translational for that reason, where it's like, all right, I can read all those ling anth people, so you don't have to, and then like, try to figure out what might be helpful for you, or like what's a stat that could maybe inhabit or that could be an instantiation of the assumptions, the theoretical assumptions that we want to make, that are maybe those theoretical assumptions are maybe coming from folks who are doing qualitative research or ethnographic research, but maybe I have a survey and I want to do stats on it. Well, hey, here's something that doesn't make the same assumptions about groups or whatever it is that, can bring in some of those ideas and also give you the graph that you want. But then the other thing that's important is there's so much about language. Again, this I think when I got hired at Michigan, I remember talking to our dean, Ann Curzan, who's a linguist, who's a wonderful linguist. And, she was like asking me about my teaching, just like you did. And I said, I'm really worried about eugenics. And she was like, what? She wasn't really expecting me to say that, but I really am. And I think that what we know about how language works and what we know about how language is learned and how people have used language to enact hierarchies of different types. It's a way to teach people about these really harmful things that are really ideologies that are super pervasive. And it can feel so intuitive, right? That's it, and that's what ideologies are, right? Things that the air that you're breathing, something that feels like it's common sense, right? So language can be such an important way to help us all see how harmful these ideologies are, that there are there. Like, we can sort of make those ideologies visible. Most of the classes I teach are the sort of undergrad classes I teach are, that's like the one linguistics class that somebody's going to take, right? It's a requirement. And it's usually, I get a lot of like business school students, engineering students, pre-med students that are like, oh, I just want an easy A, I just want to get in and out of here. And that's like I love that. I'm like, I love it. That's my ministry. That's like the folks that I want to talk to, because then by the end, a lot of them are like, oh, wow, this actually affects me, right? And that is beautiful. Not everyone needs to be a linguist, but we all need to see how language is used to oppress ourselves and each other, right? Yeah, I think that it's central. Right now, it's important to say, like, I teach a classical language and discrimination. We talk about the history of this land, and we go through that with language policy, and we do that, talking about all sorts of things. We talk about eugenics a lot because it's very important to the history of the United States. And at the very end, I was like, of that class this time, I was like, hey, I've been teaching this class since 2016. So that's like, it's been a long time. This year, I did not change much about how I taught it. Very, very little. And it was extremely resonant. Like, every day, it was like, and then here is, something a norm that's being changed or violated, or, this law that we talked about with citizenship and language being weaponized to deport people or harm people. And it could have seemed like, oh, I just sort of looked at what the headline of the week was and said it. But actually, no, it's the same. It's because it's the same shit, right? It's the same playbook. It's these same ideas that have been so persistent and pervasive. But also, right, like, what are the very ideas that are central to that class, or the things that people are trying to get rid of right now? Like, oh, again, this idea that, like, saying that race is a social construct is, like, not allowed or whatever in the classroom. But it's possible that this class is not allowed to be taught anymore. Now let's think about what that means. Like, who benefits?
If you have one, Savi, what is your favorite linguistics fact?
I'm trying to... Oh, okay. I have one. All right. So I speak a language, Malayalam. And so we know that, like, color terms are different across languages, right? So, like, how many they have, what they categorize, all these different things. And right, I have these two little kids. My husband does not speak Malayalam, but I speak Malayalam to them. And so we, like, going through, like, colors. And so we'll be like, all right, so let's say I'm saying the rainbow. All right, I'm going to say it to you in Malayalam. And then I'll stop when it's relevant. So I'll say chopa, orange. Okay, so you're like, oh, there's no word for orange. Right? So that's like that's what my husband would say, or somebody might say, and other people will say that, right? But actually, the word for orange comes from, if you go back, Malayalam, because here's how it goes. It comes from the word for like, like citrus, like a citrus fruit. So we say that naringa is the word that is my word for that. And an orange, I would say, is a madra naringa, like a sweet orange. But then we use an orange for like or the naringa for like lemon or lime too, right? Okay, so that's like the word. And then when like Portuguese, so Vasco da Gama landed in Kerala, you have a bunch of Portuguese words for that. And like they brought like, these citrus fruits up, to Europe or whatever. And actually, I think also maybe not just that, like they also came through. Anyway, there's lots of different like trade routes. You learn a lot about trade routes when you study language contact in a coastal, in a language spoken on the coast. So anyway, so it's like, so eventually, right, and also if we, different words for orange in Spanish, for example, I think it's like naranja. So it comes from narinja, naranja, hey, and then that it got borrowed into English as like norange, which then got reanalyzed as norange became an orange. And so we have orange in English, but it's actually, and then it got borrowed back as a color into Malayalam. So that's my favorite linguistic fact. It actually comes from Malayalam.
So it got borrowed back. So
as a color. So like we wouldn't
as
say
a color.
Yeah, so like if things are the color orange, right? Like, like if I wasn't using the word like oranja or something, if I wasn't saying orange in English, which that's what people would naturally do now in Kerala, because like, yeah, we know like that's the word for it. And Malayalam is just orange, right? But if I was not going to use that term, you might just say, oh, it's like a different red or something, or it's like a more yellowy red or something. Like you would just sort of describe it or be like this color, like we do for colors that we don't have like an exact Crayola crayon name for. So people like, you can talk about orange, of course, right? That's how it works in these languages where we don't like use all these different terms. But yeah, it's a loan word, right? It came back as a loan word. It was expeditious to be like, orange, perfect. But if we look back, it's not that Malayalam does not have a word for orange, but actually English wouldn't have had one either. And it comes from Malayalam too. So is that really the English word for orange? Or, and that's what I study. That's what I'm interested in.
And another fun fact about Malayalam is that it is a palindromic language.
Only in English, though. So if I'm saying it in Malayalam, I would say this, Malayalam. Okay, so the L's are different. It's la versus la.
So is that a retroflex L?
The second one is retroflex. The first one is dento, Malayalam.
So that's like a light L?
Yeah, it is like a light.
So it's not palindromic.
It's not. And there's a long A. So it's Malayalam. So it's like a long A. It's not just Malayalam or whatever. Yeah. So but in English spelling, it is palindromic.
Yes, palindromic.
And it's definitely not palindromic in Malayalam. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Just the wonders of language, right?
It's great. Loan word to the best.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I've been your host, Talia Sherman, and for 3.5 years in, I am so incredibly grateful to be able to continue doing this podcast. I love it a lot. If you want to keep listening and also help others keep listening, pass along the podcast to people that you know, share this podcast, spread the word, rate it, review it, give it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, write a hate post, write a love post, I don't care. Links to Savvy's research and labs that she's part of are all in the episode description. You can also find Tomato Tomato on YouTube, and you can find select clips from certain interviews with both audio and video. That's all on YouTube at Tomato Tomato. If you're still listening, psych, I do care whether or not you write a hate post or a love post. Write a love post and put it on your social media, preferably if you're verified. I will speak to you next time when I interview Michael Berman. That's coming up on Tomato Tomato. I'll speak to you then. Bye.